Elias Thorne lived by the quiet hum of his bees. His small, isolated property, nestled on the frayed edge of suburbia, where manicured lawns gave way to wilder woods, was less a home and more a sanctuary. For him, the world outside the protective embrace of the oak trees that ringed his land was a distant, chaotic buzz. Here, amidst the scent of pollen and propolis, with the rhythmic beat of 1,000 tiny wings, he found a peace that the modern world had long forgotten. His passion wasn't merely a hobby, it was a devotion. Each hive was a thriving metropolis, a testament to nature's intricate design, and Elias, with his gentle hands and encyclopedic knowledge, was its careful curator. He knew the distinct temperament of every colony, the subtle shifts in their collective mood, the rich, nuanced flavors of the honey they produced from the diverse wildflowers of the surrounding acreage. This year, the linden honey was exceptional. A pale, liquid gold redolent with floral notes and a whisper of mint. He'd carefully harvested the last frame of it just 2 days ago. A laborious process that required precision, patience, and a deep respect for his winged partners. He'd bottled it in a vintage glass jar, a gift from his grandmother, intending to savor its delicate sweetness over the coming weeks, a rare treat after a particularly challenging season. The morning sun, usually a welcome harbinger of a productive day, felt different today. A faint, almost imperceptible dissonance in the natural rhythm set Elias on edge. He finished his usual breakfast of oatmeal and his own wildflower honey, the one he used for daily consumption, and headed out to his workshop. The workshop, a ramshackle shed expanded over the years with salvaged timber, was where he stored his tools, his empty frames, and, crucially, his prized harvests. He kept the best honey, the truly special batches, in a cool, dark corner, away from direct sunlight and temperature fluctuations. As he pushed open the workshop door, a shiver, unrelated to the crisp morning air, prickled his skin. Something was off. The latch, usually stiff, gave way with unusual ease. Had he forgotten to secure it? Unlikely. Elias was meticulous, almost obsessive, about securing his equipment and his valuable produce. His eyes scanned the familiar chaos of the shed, noting the neat stacks of supers, the glint of his smoker, the orderly row of protective suits. Everything seemed in place until his gaze landed on the corner, where the amber gleam of the vintage jar of linden honey should have been. There was only an empty space. A cold dread, far more chilling than the early morning air, snaked through his chest. He took a step forward, then another, his breath catching in his throat. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn shelf, his fingers finding no trace of the heavy glass, only a faint, sticky residue, a cruel, taunting ghost of what was once there. The theft wasn't just of honey, it was a violation. It was an invasion of his sacred space, a desecration of his quiet dedication. Elias wasn't rich, but his beekeeping yielded enough to sustain him, to allow him his solitary existence. This particular batch of linden honey was earmarked for a special order, a local artisanal market that paid handsomely for his unique products. The loss was not just personal but professional. A low growl rumbled in his throat, surprising even himself. He paced the workshop, his mind racing through possibilities. Raccoons? Unlikely. A bear? He'd have heard it, and bears weren't usually so tidy. A human. But who? His property was remote. His gaze drifted to the fence line, the one that separated his land from the newly developed subdivision. The McMansions, with their perfectly manicured lawns and intrusive outdoor lighting, had been a constant source of low-level irritation since Karen Dubois had moved in next door. Karen. The name conjured an immediate visceral sense of annoyance. She was a caricature of suburban entitlement, a woman who treated nature as an inconvenience, and anything that didn't directly benefit her as an affront. Since her arrival 6 Months ago, she'd complained about the buzzing of his bees, the unruly wildflowers that dared to cross the property line, even the scent of his smoker. He'd tried to be neighborly, even offering her a small jar of his less prized clover honey as a peace offering, which she'd accepted with a dismissive sniff and a comment about its rustic appearance. A sudden, sharp glint caught his eye. Near the fence, amidst a patch of weeds on her side, lay a fragment of glass. He walked over, his boots crunching on dry leaves. It was a shard, small but unmistakable, from the base of a vintage jar, with a faint, embossed pattern identical to his grandmother's antique honey jar. And next to it, partially obscured by a fallen leaf, was a small circular print in the damp earth, the distinctive tread of a designer sneaker, not the rugged boots he wore. His blood ran cold, then boiled. Karen. It had to be her. The audacity. The sheer nerve of it. To walk onto his property, into his workshop, and steal from him. The theft transcended the monetary value of the honey. It was a profound act of disrespect, an open challenge to his very existence. He took a deep breath, trying to tamp down the volcanic rage simmering within him. Confrontation, though tempting, had to be handled carefully. He wasn't a confrontational man by nature. He preferred the quiet, predictable rhythm of his bees. But this was different. This was personal. He walked back to his house, his mind a maelstrom of anger and disbelief. He waited until late morning, giving himself time to compose his thoughts, to craft a calm, rational approach. He wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, however slim that might be. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps she thought it was abandoned. He tried to cling to that sliver of hope, even as his gut screamed otherwise. He walked to the invisible boundary that separated their worlds, a meticulously trimmed hedge on her side, a tangle of native shrubs on his. Karen was on her immaculate lawn, supervising a landscape crew pruning her roses. She wore a pristine white tennis outfit, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed. Her expression was one of imperious satisfaction as she gestured with an elegant hand, directing the workers. "Karen!" Elias called, his voice surprisingly steady. She turned, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, annoyance, guilt, quickly replaced by a saccharine, plastic smile. "Oh, Elias, morning. Everything all right with your buzzing?" "Things?" Her tone dripped with thinly veiled contempt for his hobby. "No, actually," Elias replied, stepping closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I had a jar of special honey, a vintage jar stolen from my workshop. I found a piece of the jar near our fence line." Karen's smile wavered for a split second, then solidified. "Stolen? Oh dear. Are you sure? Perhaps you misplaced it. You know these old houses." She waved a dismissive hand towards his sturdy, well-maintained home. "I'm quite sure," Elias insisted, his voice firm. "It was very valuable to me, both sentimentally and financially. Did you happen to see anyone on my property?" She scoffed, a tiny, almost imperceptible puff of air. "Elias, really. I have a very busy life. I don't spend my mornings watching your property. And frankly, your bees are quite loud enough without me needing to get any closer." She paused, her gaze sweeping over his slightly disheveled work clothes, a look of distaste flashing across her perfectly made-up face. "Though, if you're worried about theft, perhaps you should install some proper security. This isn't the countryside, you know. We have standards here." His carefully constructed calm began to crack. "Karen, with all due respect, I found a piece of the broken jar from that specific vintage right by your fence and a shoe print that matches your size." He saw her eyes, narrow, the saccharine facade dropping to reveal a sharp, predatory glint. "Are you accusing me, Elias?" Her voice, though low, carried a dangerous edge. The landscape workers, sensing the tension, paused their work, their shears silent. "I'm simply asking for an explanation," Elias said, trying to hold on to the last vestiges of civility. That honey was special. It was linden. It took a lot of effort to produce. Karen let out a short, sharp laugh. Linden? Oh, that honey. Yes, I did take it. She said it with an infuriating nonchalance, as if admitting to borrowing a cup of sugar. Honestly, Elias, it was just sitting there. Your workshop door was open. I thought you were just sharing. And it was rather good, actually. My morning toast has never tasted better. A little. Sticky, perhaps, but quite edible. Elias stared at her, utterly aghast. You took it? You just walked onto my property and helped yourself to my private property? Oh, don't be so dramatic, she huffed, rolling her eyes. It's honey, Elias. And you have what? 100 hives? Clearly, you have plenty to spare. I simply thought it was neighborly. A little exchange. I'm sure you wouldn't miss one jar. Her tone was condescending, as if lecturing a recalcitrant child. Besides, she added, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, it really was quite good. So thank you, I suppose. She gave him a dismissive nod, turning back to her roses as if the conversation was concluded. The blood drained from Elias's face, leaving a cold, hollow ache. This wasn't just entitlement. It was an active insult. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even slightly apologetic. She viewed him as less than human, his work as insignificant, his property as hers for the taking. The thank you was a verbal slap, delivered with an infuriating smirk. You broke the jar, Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, though it vibrated with a contained fury that he hadn't known he possessed. My grandmother's jar. The screams from Karen Dubois' patio pierced the cool evening air, a symphony of suburban panic that was, to Elias Thorne, a strangely gratifying melody. He remained hidden in the deep shadows of his overgrown yard, the heavy veil still covering his face, though he no longer needed its protection. The red barren hive, now a furious buzzing vortex, hummed with a primal energy, its thousands of inhabitants pouring out of the newly opened entrance, drawn by the sudden flurry of lights and commotion. They weren't just attacking, they were defending, reclaiming, asserting their dominion over the violated boundaries. Karen's terrified shrieks were the loudest, a piercing, almost comical sound amidst the general pandemonium. Elias watched, a detached observer, as her dinner party dissolved into a frantic, chaotic retreat. Guests, dressed in their expensive summer wear, stumbled over patio furniture, swatting wildly at the unseen assailants. The perfectly arranged hors d'oeuvres lay abandoned, quickly becoming targets for the enraged insects. A woman tripped, landing with a yelp in a flower bed, only to scramble up faster than humanly possible, covered in dirt and likely stings. The patio lights, which had moments ago illuminated a scene of smug celebration, now cast long dancing, shadows of panic. Elias saw Karen's husband, a portly man named Richard, attempting to herd their guests indoors, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. But Karen herself was still out there, caught in the heart of the storm, flailing against the invisible onslaught, her tennis whites no match for the tiny, furious stings. He could almost hear the individual thwacks of bee bodies hitting fabric, each one a minuscule declaration of war. Finally, Richard managed to drag a screaming Karen inside, slamming the heavy glass door shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the sudden, eerie silence. The buzzing continued, a low, ominous thrum, but the human screams had ceased, replaced by the muffled sounds of frantic activity within the Dubois residence. Elias knew the bees would eventually calm, returning to their hive once the immediate threat, or in this case the perceived intruders, had receded. But the message, he felt, had been delivered with crystal clarity. He stood there for a few more minutes, listening to the fading hum, ensuring the hive was settling. Then, silently, he slipped back through the dense undergrowth, the weight of the veil and gloves a comforting reminder of his successful, if unconventional, mission. Back in his workshop, he carefully replaced his gear. a strange sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He knew this wasn't the end. This was merely the opening salvo in a war he hadn't asked for, but was now fully committed to fighting. The next morning, the expected storm broke. Elias was enjoying his coffee on his porch, listening to the soft chirping of birds, when he heard it. The insistent wail of a siren growing steadily louder. It wasn't an ambulance nor a fire truck. It was a police cruiser, its blue and red, lights flashing through the trees as it pulled up Karen Dubois' immaculate driveway. He watched, unflinching, as two uniformed officers stepped out. One was a burly, no-nonsense man, the other a younger, more sympathetic-looking woman. Karen and Richard Dubois met them on their front porch. Karen still looking ruffled, a bandage visible on her neck, her usual impeccable composure clearly shattered. She was gesturing wildly, pointing in the direction of Elias's property, her voice rising in an indignant crescendo even from that distance. Elias knew what was coming. He finished his coffee, placed the mug gently on the railing, and walked down his porch steps, crossing his lawn towards the property line. He stopped just short of the hedge, hands in his pockets, adopting a stance of casual readiness. The burly officer, Officer Miller, was the first to approach. "Mr. Thorne," he called out, his voice gruff, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "That's me, officer," Elias replied calmly. "Mrs. Dubois here is making some rather serious accusations," Miller stated, gesturing towards Karen, who was now practically vibrating with outrage. "Assault with a deadly weapon, to be precise. She claims you deliberately unleashed a swarm of bees on her and her guests last night." Elias met his gaze evenly. "Officer, I run a legitimate apiary here. My bees are part of my livelihood. They're also wild animals. And like any wild animals, they can be unpredictable if provoked or disturbed." "Provoked?" Karen shrieked, marching forward, her face blotchy with indignation. "You moved that hive, you lunatic. You put it right next to my rose garden, where you know my party was. It was an act of pure malice." "Mrs. Dubois," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm, "you were on my property, in my workshop, stealing my honey yesterday. The very honey in a jar that belonged to my late grandmother, which you then admitted to breaking and simply tossing aside. My property was violated. My livelihood was threatened. My bees, being highly territorial, reacted to the disturbance near their hive, which you created by your presence and actions on my land." Officer Miller turned his gaze between the two of them, a flicker of understanding in his eyes as he took in Elias's calm demeanor versus Karen's agitated theatrics. "Is this true, ma'am?" "About the honey?" Karen hesitated, her eyes darting away for a moment. "It was a misunderstanding," she stammered, then regained her indignant bluster. "He left his workshop door open. It was just a jar of honey. It doesn't give him the right to attack innocent people with insects." "With all due respect, Mrs. Dubois," Elias interjected, "the law defines theft as taking property without permission. Whether it's just a jar of honey or $100, it's still theft. And my bees reacting to a perceived threat near their hive, on my land, after you trespassed and stole from me, is a natural, albeit unfortunate, consequence of your actions, not an attack by me." The younger officer, Officer Jenkins, stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne, did you move the hive onto her property?" "No, officer," Elias replied truthfully. "I moved a hive near the property line, on my side, within the bounds of my land. I'm legally allowed to place my hives wherever I choose on my own property." He gestured vaguely towards the hive, which was now peacefully buzzing. "They're a vital part of my business. Perhaps Mrs. Dubois found their proximity inconvenient, but that's a zoning issue, not a criminal one." Miller scratched his chin. "So you're saying the bees just decided to fly over to her patio?" "They are foraging insects, officer," Elias explained patiently. They fly where they please within their range, and they are highly defensive of their colony. If their primary entrance is facing a large gathering of noisy people, and those people were previously involved in disturbing their beekeeper's property, well, the bees are simply doing what bees do. He deliberately avoided mentioning he'd lifted the inner cover, a detail that would only complicate matters. His actions were, technically, within his rights as a beekeeper managing his hives. Karen let out an exasperated scream. "He's lying! He released them!" "Do you have any proof, Mrs. Dubois?" Officer Jenkins asked, her tone now turning skeptical. "Witnesses who saw him physically releasing them, or evidence of how he released them?" Karen stammered. "Well, no, but it was obvious. The buzzing started so suddenly he was over there in the shadows." "I was securing my property, officer," Elias said calmly. "After someone had violated it, I was ensuring my valuable assets were safe. My bees are part of those assets. They were agitated, understandably." Officer Miller sighed, clearly frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence and the emotional outburst from Karen. "Look, Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Dubois, we're not going to get anywhere like this. Mrs. Dubois, while we understand your distress, there's no direct evidence Mr. Thorne intentionally assaulted you with bees. His account of theft and trespass, though, does complicate things." He turned back to Elias. "However, given the proximity of your hives to her property, especially after an incident like this, it might be advisable to reconsider their placement, for the sake of neighborhood peace." "I will consider it, officer," Elias said, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "When Mrs. Dubois returns my property and offers a sincere apology for trespassing and theft, I will certainly consider it." Karen gasped, but Miller raised a hand. "All right, that's enough for now. We'll file a report, but without more evidence, there's not much we can do on the criminal side for either of you. Mrs. Dubois, we recommend you consult with your attorney regarding the alleged theft and trespass. Mr. Thorne, we recommend you seek legal counsel regarding your property concerns as well. This appears to be a civil dispute, not a criminal matter." With that, the officers, looking weary, retreated to their cruiser. Karen glared at Elias, her face a mask of venomous hatred. "You haven't heard the last of this, Thorne," she hissed, before turning and stomping back into her house. Elias simply nodded, a serene expression on his face. "I never expected to, Karen." He watched the police car drive away, a feeling of quiet triumph swelling within him. He had faced her down, calmly and rationally, and emerged, if not victorious, then certainly not defeated. The law, for once, seemed to be on his side. But he knew Karen. This was far from over. Her type didn't concede. They escalated, and escalate she did. The following days brought a flurry of retaliatory measures, each one designed to disrupt Elias's peaceful existence. First came the anonymous complaints to the local council about unsightly weeds, overgrown trees, and of course the public nuisance. The call to Silas ignited a grim purpose in Elias. The days that followed were a blur of intense, clandestine preparation. Silas, true to his word, arrived 3 mornings later in a nondescript, mud-splattered truck, its bed covered by a heavy tarp. He was a man woven from sinew and silence, his eyes keen and intelligent, reflecting a deep respect for the natural world. He didn't offer platitudes or express judgment. He simply grasped the gravity of the situation and the depth of Elias's resolve. "This is a different beast, Elias," Silas had warned, his voice a low rumble. "Not just a hive. We're talking about an entire apiary, a manufactured swarm. It's got to be timed perfectly, executed flawlessly. The repercussions, they'll be immense." Elias had simply nodded, his jaw set. Immense is precisely what's needed. Silas brought with him specialized equipment, a portable, climate-controlled transport unit designed for massive bee colonies, a high-frequency acoustic disruptor, used, Silas explained, to disorient and herd bees without harm. During large-scale relocations, and an arsenal of protective gear far more robust than Elias's own. They spent hours poring over maps of the property, discussing wind patterns, sunlight angles, and the optimal dispersal points. Their target wasn't just Karen's yard, but a wider radius, a blanket of buzzing retribution. The bees Silas provided were a specific breed, a highly prolific, notoriously defensive strain known for their aggressive swarming behavior when disturbed. They weren't meant for honey production, they were bred for pollination projects in difficult environments, resilient, and utterly uncompromising. Elias felt a pang of unease at the sheer power they represented, a force of nature being harnessed for a very human vendetta. But the image of his dying bees, twitching on the bottom board, hardened his heart. Karen had opened this door. They planned for dusk on Saturday, the peak of weekend activity in the affluent subdivision. Elias tracked Karen's movements, observing her predictable routine. Saturday meant her elaborate garden party, a bigger, more extravagant affair than the impromptu gathering that had met the Red Baron Hive. It was the perfect stage. The transport unit was set up deep in Elias's woods, a good distance from the property line. Inside were dozens of newly acquired hives, each teeming with hundreds of thousands of agitated bees. The combined hum was a deep, resonant throb, vibrating through the earth. Elias worked methodically, his movements precise, almost ritualistic, as he and Silas prepared the colonies for their grand unveiling. On Saturday afternoon, as the scent of grilling meat and the murmur of polite conversation began to drift over, from Karen's property, Elias and Silas donned their full-body, heavy-duty suits. These weren't just beekeeping suits. They were industrial-grade, almost entirely impervious to stings, fitted with reinforced helmets and heavy-duty gloves. The air inside felt thick and hot, but Elias barely noticed. His focus was absolute. "All right, Elias," Silas said, his voice muffled by the helmet speaker. "Remember the sequence. Dispersal at my mark. We'll use the acoustic disruptor to guide them initially, then let natural instinct take over. They'll gravitate towards the largest, most active heat signatures and the brightest light sources. Which means her party." Elias nodded, adjusting his visor. Understood. As the last rays of sunlight faded, plunging the neighborhood into the soft glow of twilight, the sounds from Karen's party grew louder. Music, laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses. Elias could picture it. Karen, resplendent in some new designer outfit, holding court, completely oblivious to the impending storm. At Silas's signal, Elias engaged the first release mechanism. A low, vibrating hum, distinct from the natural. Buzz filled the air. Then, with a soft hiss of compressed air, the first hive in the transport unit opened. A trickle of bees at first, then a steady stream, then an outpouring, a dark, living cloud emerging into the twilight. Silas activated the acoustic disruptor, a device that emitted a high-frequency tone only audible to insects. It wasn't harmful, but it was profoundly disorienting, acting as an invisible hand guiding the torrent of bees. The cloud began to drift, a living current, directed by Silas's careful manipulation, moving towards Karen's glowing backyard. More hives were opened, more waves of bees joining the airborne river. The air grew thick with their collective hum, a sound that started as a whisper and rapidly swelled into a deafening roar. It was primal, terrifying, and awe-inspiring. Elias felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He was unleashing something ancient, something untamed, and it was glorious. On Karen's patio, the party was in full swing. The fairy lights twinkled, the music was lively, and Karen, indeed, was holding court, regaling her guests with a story, likely about her latest triumph over some imagined slight. Her laughter rang out clear and condescending. Then a guest pointed, their voice a nervous stutter. "What? What's that sound? The music suddenly seemed too loud, then too quiet as a deeper, more pervasive hum began to infiltrate the festivities. People looked up, bewildered. The air grew dense, a strange flickering haze appearing above the rose garden. The first bee, a lone scout, darted under a patio umbrella. Then another, and another. A single panicked shriek erupted. The music abruptly cut out, replaced by the rapidly escalating roar of millions of beating wings. The swarm descended. It wasn't just a few bees. It was a living, breathing blanket of insects, a dark, undulating cloud that poured over Karen's pristine yard, blanketing her prize roses, engulfing the patio, swirling around the terrified guests. The air was thick with their frantic flight, the sheer number creating a terrifying, suffocating sensation. Screams, louder and more desperate than the last time, tore through the night, glasses shattered, food splattered, people tripped over each other, a panicked mass of humanity desperate to escape the relentless, stinging torrent. Elias watched, a ghost in his protective suit, as the chaos erupted. Karen's voice, once so imperious, was reduced to a series of guttural, terrified wails. She was enveloped, her white dress disappearing under a moving cloak of agitated bees. She clawed at her face, her arms trying to swat away the relentless onslaught. Richard, his face ashen, tried to pull her, but she was thrashing too violently. The swarm flowed into the house through open doors, through neglected windows, following the heat and the light. Elias heard the crashing of objects inside, the frantic slamming of doors. The entire Dubois mansion, a monument to suburban excess, became a buzzing, stinging nightmare. Elias had directed the initial surge, but now the swarm was acting on its own, a natural force unleashed. They were drawn to the brightest lights, the loudest noises, the greatest concentrations of CO2, all emanating from Karen's house and her fleeing guests. It was a living, breathing punishment, tailored precisely to her brand of entitled, ignorant disruption. He saw guests, some stung, multiple times tumbling into their luxury cars, fumbling with keys, desperate to escape. One man, clearly in distress, ripped off his shirt, revealing a chest covered in angry red welts. A woman was sobbing hysterically, her face buried in her hands. Karen's last visible act was to collapse, a white heap on her now bee-covered patio. Before Richard finally managed to drag her inside, the heavy front door slamming shut, muffling her final hoarse shriek. Silence, broken only by the continuous angry hum of the millions of bees now occupying Karen's yard, settled over the immediate vicinity. The lights inside her house flickered, then died, plunging the mansion into darkness. The party was over. The subdivision, usually alive with weekend revelry, was eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of screeching tires as the last of Karen's. Guests made their escape. Elias and Silas remained, unmoving, until the initial frenzy subsided and the swarm began to settle, forming dense clusters on trees on the side of Karen's house, on her rose bushes. It was a terrifying, beautiful spectacle of nature's raw power. "They'll settle there for a few days," Silas's voice crackled over the helmet intercom. "Maybe longer. They'll establish a temporary colony, then they'll scout for a new permanent home. We'll retrieve them then, but for now, they've got work to do." Elias felt a wave of exhaustion, both physical and emotional, wash over him. His body ached, but his spirit, for the first time in days, felt strangely light. The immediate, overwhelming terror he had inflicted was a harsh, undeniable lesson. But the true lasting consequence was yet to unfold. He looked at Karen's darkened house, then back at his own, a sanctuary once again. He understood the gravity of his actions. He had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. But he had also protected what was his and delivered a stark, unforgettable message about respect for the natural world. As he and Silas packed up the empty transport unit, the hum of the temporary massive colony in Karen's yard became the dominant sound of the night. It was a warning, a promise. And for Karen Dubois, it was just the beginning of a living, buzzing siege. Elias knew she would try to fight back, but against this force, against nature itself, she would find herself, utterly, irrevocably, outmatched. The sweet revenge had only just begun to sting. The dawn that followed the great swarm broke with an unsettling quiet, a stark contrast to the previous night's cacophony. For Karen Dubois, however, the silence was merely an illusion, a thin veil over the relentless, pervasive buzz that vibrated through every surface of her once pristine mansion. It was a sound that had burrowed deep into her skull, a constant, maddening hum that pulsed with every beat of her fear-addled heart. She lay huddled on her lavish sofa, wrapped in a silk throw that felt like a flimsy shield against the invisible tormentors. Her face was swollen, dotted with angry red welts, particularly around her eyes and neck. Richard, her usually unflappable husband, was pacing the living room, a phone pressed to his ear, his voice a strained whisper. No, you don't understand," he was saying, his words tight with frustration. "It's not just a few bees. It's a living cloud. They're everywhere. The house, the trees, the pool. Yes, the pool is completely covered. My wife is highly allergic and has been stung multiple times," Karen whimpered, pulling the throw tighter. The memory of the previous night was a horrific blur. The beautiful party, the sudden, inexplicable hum, the dark, swirling cloud, the agonizing, fiery pinpricks, the screams, her own terrified collapse. She'd spent half the night in the emergency room, pumped full of antihistamines, her usual imperious demeanor replaced by a terrified, itching misery. Richard hung up, his face grim. "No luck. Every pest control service is either booked solid or refusing to touch that scale of infestation." One guy actually laughed and said, "You need an apiarist, not an exterminator, and good luck getting one of them to touch that many angry bees." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. He hinted it was some kind of managed swarm, not natural. Karen sat bolt upright, wincing as her skin stretched. "Managed? What are you talking about? It was an attack. That man next door, Elias Thorne, he did this. He unleashed them on us." Her voice was hoarse, raw with indignation and fear. Richard looked at her, his expression a mixture of exasperation and genuine concern. "Karen, the police said there's no proof, and frankly, your misunderstanding with his honey didn't help our case. No one believes he orchestrated a bee attack. It's absurd." "Absurd?" she shrieked, gesturing wildly towards the windows, which were now dark with the settled clusters of bees. "Look out there, Richard! It's a horror show! My roses! My perfectly manicured lawn! My patio! It's ruined! And the noise! Can't you hear it? It's driving me mad!" Richard could indeed hear it. The buzzing was less a sound and more a living presence, a low, guttural vibration that seeped through the walls, through the very foundations of their home. It was the sound of millions of tiny wings, an ongoing, infuriating reminder of their complete loss of control. "We need to call someone else," Karen insisted, jumping up. "The city, the mayor, anyone with authority. This is a public health hazard, a clear and present danger to our property values." Richard nodded, defeated. "I'll try the city, but the police already said it's a civil matter." The next few days were a living nightmare for the Dubois family. The swarm, instead of dissipating, seemed to solidify its presence. The massive clusters remained on the side of their house, clinging to the eaves, coating the rose bushes like grotesque living flowers. Some adventurous scouts found their way inside, causing Karen to shriek every time she saw a buzzing shadow near a window. She refused to open any doors or windows, trapping them in a suffocating, bee-buzzing prison of their own making. Their carefully curated suburban life unraveled. Deliveries stopped. The pool service, the lawn care crew, even the maid, all refused to approach the property, citing safety concerns. The scent of blooming roses was replaced by the cloying, faintly sweet odor of honey and propolis, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Karen tried everything. She called every pest control service in a 50-mile radius, each conversation ending in either polite refusal or thinly veiled amusement. She threatened lawsuits, she pleaded, she even tried to bribe. No one would come. The scale of the swarm, the unusual nature of its presence, and the unspoken understanding that it wasn't just a natural infestation, deterred them all. They knew an apiarist had to be involved, and no reputable apiarist would touch a problem created by another. She even tried to Google how to get rid of bees, which yielded endless results about gentle removal and honeybee conservation. Her attempts to blast them with a garden hose only enraged them further, sending furious waves of bees surging towards the water, prompting more frantic retreats indoors. Richard, meanwhile, discovered the true extent of the damage. The swarm had coated the outdoor furniture with a sticky film. Honeycomb was beginning to form in sheltered spots under the eaves and within the thickest clusters. Their pristine white house was now textured with a living, humming mass. The property value, he knew, was plummeting by the hour. The tension between Karen and Richard mounted. Her constant complaints, her frantic, desperate schemes, and her growing paranoia pushed him to the brink. "Karen, you have to admit," he ventured one evening, his voice carefully modulated, "this all started after you. Well, after you took Elias's honey, and now, this. Are you blaming me?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "He's a madman, a bee terrorist. He's waging war on us. And you just stand there letting it happen." "What do you want me to do, Karen?" Richard exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "Go out there with a fly swatter? These aren't gnats. This is biblical." He rubbed his temples. "We need a professional, someone who actually understands this thing." Karen, defeated but not deterred, had an epiphany. "The council, the city council, they have to intervene. This is a public nuisance, a health hazard. It's affecting the entire neighborhood's property values. They have to issue an order, force him to remove them." The next morning, Karen, despite her protests from Richard about her appearance, dressed in what she considered her most authoritative outfit, a crisp, if slightly rumpled, linen suit, and drove to the city council meeting. She arrived early, armed with photos of her bee-infested property, the bandaged stings still visible on her neck. She waited impatiently through various mundane agenda items, zoning variances, garbage collection schedules, until finally, her turn came for public comment. She strode to the podium, her head held high, and launched into a passionate, furious diatribe. "Council members, esteemed residents," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured indignation, "I stand before you today not as a homeowner, but as a victim of ecological terrorism. My neighbor, Elias Thorne, a man who lives like a hermit, has deliberately unleashed a plague of bees upon my family and my home." She held up the photos, displaying the images of her bee-covered house and yard. Gasps rippled through the audience. "My property has been rendered uninhabitable. My family has suffered severe stings. Our very lives are at risk. This is not just a nuisance, it is an assault. I demand that the City Council take immediate, decisive action to compel Mr. Thorne to remove this abomination from my property and to compensate us for the immense damages incurred," she continued, painting Elias as a deranged eco-fanatic, herself as an innocent victim. She spoke of property values, public safety, and the sanctity of suburban peace. She finished with a dramatic flourish, her voice ringing with self-righteous fury. A beat of silence. Then, a few murmurs from the audience, some sympathetic, some skeptical. The council chairman, a seasoned politician named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Dubois," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Your concerns are certainly compelling. However, the city has already been in contact with Mr. Thorne regarding this matter. He maintains that his apiary operations are fully compliant with city ordinances. Furthermore, he has submitted a counter-complaint regarding trespass and theft of his property, which he alleges initiated this unfortunate incident." Karen's jaw dropped. His allegations are preposterous." "Nonetheless, Mrs. Dubois," Henderson continued, unperturbed, "Mr. Thorne is a registered beekeeper. His bees are not considered pests in the same way as, say, termites. They are a protected species, vital to local agriculture and ecology. The city cannot simply order the extermination or removal of a healthy established bee colony without due process, especially when said colony is on the beekeeper's own land." "But they're on my property," Karen shrieked. "As a temporary swarm, Mrs. Dubois," Henderson corrected patiently, which, Mr. Thorne argues, was a direct response to a significant disturbance near their parent hive. This, as the police have stated, appears to be a civil dispute. The city's jurisdiction is limited. Another council member, a stern-faced woman, added, "And furthermore, Mrs. Dubois, we've received an unusually high number of calls over the past few days. Not just from you. We've had calls from various residents of this subdivision. And interestingly, many of those calls have been in support of Mr. Thorne and his beekeeping operation, complaining about the excessive use of pesticides in the area, and even offering him condolences regarding the alleged poisoning of one of his hives." Karen blanched. The public support for Elias, combined with the mention of the poisoned hive, was a brutal, unexpected blow. It became clear with a sickening lurch that Elias hadn't just retaliated. He had garnered sympathy. He had turned the tables, framey. The revelation of the bees inside her meticulously curated mansion shattered Karen Dubois' last vestiges of composure. It wasn't just a physical invasion, it was a psychological siege. Her home, her sanctuary, the fortress of her carefully constructed life had been breached, corrupted from within by the very forces she had so arrogantly dismissed. The guest bedroom, once a pristine tableau of unused luxury, now pulsed with a living hum, its very air thick with the scent of wild honey and propolis. Richard, discovering the extent of the internal infestation, could only stare, his face a mask of horrified resignation. Clusters of bees clung to the ceiling fan, to the drapes, to the ornate headboard. A thick, dark stream of them flowed in and out of a small, unsealed gap around the window frame, leading directly to the massive external swarm. The humming was no longer a distant annoyance. It was a resonant, all-encompassing vibration that permeated the very silence of the house. Karen retreated into a state of frantic, almost maniacal desperation. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow seemed to hold a buzzing threat, every faint vibration a prelude to a sting. She walked the house like a ghost, wrapped perpetually in her silk throw, swatting at imaginary insects, her eyes wide with a paranoia that bordered on madness. "We have to burn them out!" she shrieked one afternoon, clutching a bottle of hairspray and a lighter, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying intensity. Richard wrestled them from her hands, his patience worn to a fragile thread. "Karen, no! You'll burn down the house, and they're bees, not cockroaches. You can't just spray them with Raid," he pleaded, gesturing to the dozen cans of industrial-strength insect killer she'd inexplicably ordered. The house reeked of chemicals, a futile attempt to fumigate an enemy immune to such crude tactics. They tried everything. They blasted the air conditioning to Arctic temperatures, hoping to freeze them out. The bees merely huddled closer, their combined body heat forming warm, buzzing clots against the cold. They played loud, discordant music, hoping to drive them away. The bees hummed right over it, an unwavering rhythmic counterpoint to the racket. Karen even tried to vacuum them up, only to have the vacuum cleaner become a humming, vibrating death trap, spitting out furious, disoriented bees into the room. The psychological toll was immense. Karen, once defined by her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate appearance, became disheveled, her skin constantly itching, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Richard, meanwhile, was slowly but surely reaching his breaking point. The financial implications alone were staggering. Their home, once a beacon of aspirational living, was now a public spectacle, its value plummeting by the day. Real estate agents, once eager to list their property, now politely but firmly declined. Neighbors, once eager for an invitation to her parties, now actively avoided her, their polite smiles replaced by thinly veiled pity or outright scorn. The few remaining friends they had were too afraid to visit, their fear of the bee house outweighing any social obligation. Karen's phone, once constantly abuzz with invitations and gossip, had fallen silent. She was isolated, trapped in a buzzing, sticky prison, a direct mirror of the closed-off world she had so often tried to impose on Elias. One particularly sweltering afternoon, as the internal buzzing felt louder than ever, a new, sickeningly sweet scent began to permeate the house. Not the faint, pleasant aroma of honey, but an overwhelming, cloying sweetness, almost sickly. It was coming from the guest bedroom. Richard, steeling himself, went to investigate. He pushed open the door and recoiled. From the ceiling fan, from behind the drapes, from deep within the walls, amber rivulets were beginning to seep. The bees weren't just living there, they were building. Honeycomb, heavy with liquid gold, was expanding, dripping, creating a sticky, viscous mess on the carpet, staining the pristine wallpaper. "Richard, what is that smell?" Karen shrieked from the living room. "Honey! Karen!" he replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They're building nests. They're making honey inside the walls, inside our house." He stared at the dripping honey, a horrifying realization dawning on him. This wasn't a temporary infestation. This was a hostile takeover. Karen appeared in the doorway, took one look at the sticky, glistening horror, and let out a sound that was less a scream and more a choked sob. Her knees buckled. Richard finally broke. He sat her down, forcing her to look at him. "Karen, this has to stop. We can't live like this. The house is being destroyed. We're being destroyed." He ran a trembling hand over his face. "We have two choices. We can abandon the house, try to sell it for pennies on the dollar to some company that specializes in biohazard cleanup, and start over somewhere else. Or—" he paused, his gaze drifting towards Elias's property. "Or we go to him. We go to Elias Thorne, and we beg." Karen stared at him, her eyes wide, uncomprehending. "Beg? To him? Never. He's the reason for this. He's a monster." "He's the only one who can help us," Richard countered, his voice rising. "He's a beekeeper. This isn't just a pest problem, it's a bee problem. And he's the only apiarist anyone will even talk about in connection with this mess. Don't you see? No one else wants to touch it because they all know he's involved, or at least they suspect this isn't natural," he continued, his voice softer now, pleading. "Karen, remember the city council, the police? They all sided with him. They know you stole his honey. This is karma, Karen, and he's the only one who can lift it." Karen's pride, once an unyielding shield, had begun to crack under the relentless pressure of the buzzing, the stickiness, the humiliation. She looked around her ruined home, at the honey dripping down the walls, at her swollen, itching hands, and then at Richard's desperate, weary face. The fight had drained out of her. What do we do?" she whispered, her voice fragile, almost childlike. "We go to him," Richard repeated, "and we apologize. Sincerely, for everything. The Walk to Elias's property felt like an odyssey. Karen, dressed in a faded tracksuit, her hair a tangled mess, her face devoid of makeup, looked nothing like the imperious socialite she once was. Richard walked beside her, his shoulders slumped. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken regrets and a crushing sense of defeat. As they approached Elias's rustic gate, a figure emerged from the depths of his apiary. It was Elias, in his usual work clothes, a tranquil expression on his face, a smoker gently puffing in his hand. He looked up, his gaze steady, devoid of triumph or malice, merely a quiet recognition. Karen stopped short of the gate, her heart pounding. The familiar hum of Elias's bees was audible, a gentle, soothing sound compared to the maddening buzz that filled her own home. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Mr. Thorne," Richard began, his voice hoarse. We need to talk." Elias nodded, his eyes on Karen. "I'm listening." Karen hesitated, her usual words of deflection and accusation dying in her throat. She looked at the quiet beekeeper, at the peaceful order of his hives, and then back at her own ruined life. The words, when they finally came, were strained, painful, and utterly sincere. "Elias," she began, her voice barely a whisper, I was wrong. About everything. I took your honey. I trespassed. I broke your grandmother's jar, and I'm so sorry." The apology tasted bitter, but it was real. Her eyes filled with tears, not of self-pity, but of genuine remorse. And I think you were right. I think I poisoned your bees. I didn't mean to harm them, not really. I wasn't thinking. I didn't understand." Richard stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne, our house, it's uninhabitable. The bees are inside. They're building nests. We've tried everything. No one will help us. We're desperate. Please, can you help us? Please remove them." Elias looked from Richard's pleading face to Karen's tear-streaked, humbled expression. He saw genuine distress, not just anger. The fury that had driven him had begun to dissipate days ago, replaced by a quiet sense of justice fulfilled. He had made his point. He took a deep breath. "Karen, what you did was wrong, not just to me, but to the bees. They are living creatures, vital to our world. They are not a nuisance to be exterminated or a resource to be taken lightly." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "I understand desperation, and I understand fear." He walked towards them, stopping just inside his gate. "The bees that are in your house, those are the bees Silas brought. They were meant to make a point. They are not my bees, but they are still living creatures, and they can be removed without harm. But it will take time, and it will take an acknowledgement." Karen looked up, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Acknowledgement of what?" "Of respect," Elias said simply. "For nature, for boundaries, for property, and for what you did. Not just with me, but in how you treat the world around you." He looked at her, his gaze piercing. "You have to understand the consequences of your actions, Karen. Truly understand them." Karen nodded, slowly, gravely. "I do, Elias. I truly do. I understand now." "Very well," Elias said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "I will call Silas. He will come and remove the bees from your property, both inside and out, but it will require cooperation, and it will require patience. They won't just disappear overnight, and the damage they've caused, that will be up to you to repair." Richard let out a shaky breath of relief. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Thank you so much. Anything you need? Anything at all?" Karen, still tearful, managed a small, genuine